Hello, everyone. We're going to get started on the webinar to discuss 3 environmental evaluation organizations in just a minute, allowing a few more people to come on. Okay, just one more minute and we'll get started. Okay, everyone. We are having a little trouble bringing our moderator on board, so I'm going to get started, and then we will see if we can bring her on as we move forward. So thank you, everyone, for joining the call. This session is being hosted by the American Evaluation Association's Environmental Program Evaluation Topical Interest Group. The purpose of the webinar is to really help clarify everyone's understanding of 3 of the most prominent organizations in the environmental evaluation field. Those are the Conservation Measures Partnership, the Environmental Evaluators Network, and the American Evaluation Association's Environmental Topical Interest Group. So today in the webinar, we are going to just give, after this brief introduction, an overview of each organization. So we're going to have one person from each of the organizations provide a kind of 5 to 7 minute overview of the history of the organization, who tends to be a member, what are some of the primary activities they engage in. And then the rest of the time, and we won't take questions during that time, we'll just kind of hold our questions for the remainder of the hour, which will be to have an open question and answer period with participants to answer some of the key questions that you might have about what are the real similarities and differences amongst these organizations. When might you consider joining one versus another, and how you might get involved if you'd like to be. And during that question and answer period, and we'll note this again as we get closer to it, you'll have the opportunity to either raise your hand through the webinar feature and ask to pose a question to the panelists, or you may send via a question via the question feature in the webinar, and we'll read that off to the panelists. So what we're going to do is go through each one of the speakers. So Nick Solaski from Foundations of Success will be providing an overview of the Conservation Measures Partnership, and then Matt Keene from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency will talk about the Environmental Evaluators Network, and then Christina Caglianis from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation will talk about the American Evaluation Association. And if we can bring Yvonne Watson on, she will be moderating the question and answer period. So we'll turn it over to Nick. And Nick, I believe you will turn over controls to you so you can start.
Okay, can folks hear me? You probably can't reply. Okay, so let me share my screen here, and I'm going to talk briefly about, actually you get 2 for 1 here, the Conservation Measures Partnership and the Conservation Coaches Network, and we jointly work on something called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. So the Conservation Measures Partnership is a community of practice for organizations and agencies, and it started about 10 years ago when representatives of a few organizations that you see here got together to share common experiences for an afternoon about all things related to performance measures and evaluation. We found so much we had so much to talk about. We turned it into a regular forum, and now this community of practice meets a couple times by phone and in person every year. We've added a bunch of different conservation NGOs that you see here. Recently, we've been adding some of the funders who are involved in the conservation sector, and even more recently, some of the government agencies around the world who do this work. So it is a community of practice. It's not a legal entity, but it's a way for people who represent organizations and agencies to come together and share work. The Conservation Coaches Network is our sister network, and it really is a network of coaches, of individuals who work for these organizations who provide training and coaching in these kinds of approaches that I'm going to be talking about. It has franchises located around the world. So we're interested in managing conservation projects. For us, projects come in all shapes and sizes. It could be neighbors working on local restoration. It could be a provincial national park, a range-wide plan for a species, standard performance measures for a funding program, cross-agency work at the scale of Lake Ontario, or even an entire state. And as you all know, conservation projects take place in very complex situations. My computer's jammed here for a second, Christine, I'm sorry. What's going on here? Okay, they take place in complex and dynamic systems. They need to deal with ongoing and unpredictable change, and we're dealing with rapidly changing competitors, like a lot of the fields you all work in. And project teams don't have enough information, must work in the face of uncertainty, and it can improve and learn. So to do that, a few years back, when we started this work, we got together, we looked at how other fields, we wanted to learn from what other fields had done in the work in terms of dealing with these issues. So we looked at business and management, and development, and all those different fields to see how did they approach these problems. The next slide is scary, but it's the history of performance measures in the business world as we saw it. Each of these blue boxes is a different system for tackling this question of how do we do evaluation and learning. So things like Six Sigma, balanced scorecard, all those kinds of things. I'll spare you all the gory details, but what we learned based on this work is that in every one of those fields, as most of you probably know, we went from doing big evaluations at the end of a project or program to more ongoing evaluations to doing project cycle-based monitoring. And so that was a real lesson for us, that we had to do our learning in the context of project cycle-based monitoring. The second thing we learned is that there's different questions that require different answers. So the question of how species or how ecosystems are doing, how is that salmon doing, how is that habitat doing, is an important question, but it's a very different question. It requires different systems than the question of, if we're dumping woody debris in a stream because we think it's going to lead to better salmon habitat, is that action actually working? And then the last part of the equation was that we found we were all using similar approaches, but we were confusing the heck out of each other with words. So I'm sure you've all been in these endless debates about what's bigger, a goal or an objective, and how do they all fit together and things like that. So we looked at the different terms folks were using and used that to create what we call the open standards for the practice of conservation. The word open comes from the idea of open source. No one owns them. Anyone can take and use them. These are the steps in the open standards. It's not that different than what Deming invented 50 years ago, Plan, Check, Do, Act, but it's a set of tools and approaches for doing this in conservation world that's in a common fashion. And so real quickly, you help people define what the scope of their project is, what is it that you care about, you talk about who's on the project team using these standards, you come up with a conceptual model of the system, what is it that you care about, maybe that turtle is becoming someone's dinner, maybe those fish are being commercially harvested, but they're also a source of income for local people. So the first step of the standards has people map out what the system looks like. The second step says, then what are you going to do about it? So what actions are you going to take? And the idea is to be strategic, not to just say what you are going to do, but also what you're not going to do and why. So the open standards provide a lot of tools for figuring out which targets require attention, which threats are most critical, and how do we spend our limited time and treasure to change that situation. So then maybe in this case, we're going to set up a community-managed no-take zone, and we ask people to then come up with a theory of change or a results chain that says how is that action, what's the hypothesis about how that action will lead to the desired outcome. Based on that, we ask people to figure out how to implement the action, but also to collect monitoring data as part of the regular work. In this case, counting the numbers of clams before and after they set up that no-take zone that the community is interested in. Then the fourth step is to analyze that information. In this case, you can see the blue boxes were the numbers and sizes of clams they had before, the orange was after. So in this case, their intervention worked, but obviously if your intervention doesn't work, well then you want to learn and adapt based on that. And then the last part of the open standards are to share that learning, to capture it and share it with everyone around the world. So for us, the open standards, what the CMP does is it promotes these open standards and it promotes this way of thinking in the conservation sector. As you know, these open standards, that's the kind of generic way of doing it, but if you're the EPA, you might do it doing that way. If you're the Utah Fish and Wildlife Service, you might use that tool. And if you're USAID, you might use the program cycle. And all of these different approaches, these languages, can be informed by tools of the open standards. We don't demand that people use the open standards, but the principles and practices behind this kind of work. And we're working with all those different agencies to get that involved. So what CMP and the Coaches Network do is we actually are the managers of these open standards, and we actually have gone from version 1 to 2 to 3, and we're kind of collecting the best practice in our field. We provide guidance on how to do different steps, and we also provide, us and our members provide coaching into teams that want to use this kind of work. We also have training courses for universities around the world where you learn how to do open standards. There's this Coaches Network where people work, and we offer training courses at places like agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service. The partnership has also developed standard terms and lexicons to describe our work. So if that's the problem you're facing, you have a bunch of cows in your stream. If one team calls that cows, the next cattle, the next livestock, the next grazing, the next ranching, you'll never find each other in a database because you all have different names for the same problem. So especially for the problems and then for the actions, we've come up working with IUCN to a set of global classifications of how to describe the ontologies of the work that we're doing. And that's another role of the CMP, is to manage that kind of classification work. We also have a software system called Merati, which supports the implementation of the standards. So just like TurboTax helps you do your taxes, Merati is a tool that actually walks you step by step through the process of the open standards and then gives you the tools to do this work in diagram form in a way that can be shared. And so if we think about a conservation project, which is implemented using Merati software, we can then also think about a program, which is a bunch of related projects that are all doing something similar. And in a new software called Merati Share, we can aggregate that information in a database. And because we have different interventions being taken in slightly different conditions by different people, hopefully we can start to learn about the conditions under which these interventions work. So if we create this culture of data sharing, then if we're doing things like dumping woody debris in a stream to make better salmon habitat, we don't necessarily know if that technique works. But if a bunch of people do it, collect common information using common indicators, and then share that information, people like Andrew Pullen at the Center for Evidence-Based Conservation, they can take and do meta-analysis of those interventions and really learn about what works and what doesn't work. So what the CMP and what the Coaches Network are fundamentally trying to do is we think that If we have common standards that meet organization needs, we provide training and outreach tools, we provide a standard nomenclature, software guidance for specific projects, and then databases to find and analyze and roll up project information, what we're really creating are the ingredients for adaptive management of learning, or in other words, an applied evidence-based science of conservation. And we see the role of the Conservation Measures Partnership and the Coaches Network is really to support this kind of work both within our members but around the world globally. So the last couple slides I just want to leave you with is our fundamental hypothesis, our mission, if you will, what we're trying to accomplish, is if you look at conservation interventions around the world, some fraction of them are going to be successful, shown by the green, and some fraction of them are not going to be successful, shown by the failures. And what we believe, our hypothesis, is that if we invest some work in adaptive management, some time and resources in adaptive management, it may lower the overall pie of money that's being applied to work, but if we can learn and improve and get things better over time, we can actually increase the amount of success that's happening, and that's going to pay off, have this work pay off that we're doing. So that's a ton in a hurry about the Conservation Measures Partnership. You can find out more information about FOS, who I work for CMP, and then Meraki here. You can also get a free trial of Meraki software. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I am going to present next on the Environmental Evaluation Association, and then Matt Keene will come on board for the Environmental Evaluators Network. Unless, Matt, you are on right now. Okay.
He is on right now. I can make him a presenter.
Okay, please do. Thank you.
Matt, can you confirm that you're able to speak and we can hear you?
Okay, well, while we figure that out, perhaps I'll start and then we can bring Matt on board.
Okay, 1 second.
All right, can people see my screen?
Actually, we can't, Christina, not yet.
Not yet.
Okay, well, forgive us. This is our first time with a webinar, so we're learning. Okay, I think here we go. All right.
You're all good.
Okay, thank you. Well, sorry about that, everyone. Christina Cacoyanis, I'm the current chair of the American Evaluation Association's Environmental Program Evaluation Topical Interest Group. That's a huge mouthful, so I'm just going to say the Environmental TIG for short for the remainder of my short talk. I'll be brief since I suspect that actually most of you are probably members of the Environmental TIG, but for those who aren't, I'll just give a little bit of background about the American Evaluation Association and the TIG specifically. Okay, so the American Evaluation Association has almost 7,000 members. It has the following mission: to improve evaluation practice, methods, use, and the profession itself. Most of the membership activities revolve around these topical interest groups, or TIGs. And the AEA has over 50 of them, so only one of which is obviously the Environmental Program Evaluation TIG, which is hosting this webinar. And the primary role of the TIGs is to review proposals and to organize a strand of sessions for the annual conference under each of their topic areas. This year's conference will be in Chicago this November. But other purposes are to encourage members to share relevant evaluation information, to mentor new members, and to reach out to other professional organizations. Specifically, the environmental TIG has been around since at least the early 2000s. It has over 250 members, and it's led by a 6-member leadership team. Our TIG gets involved in a few main activities. Definitely our primary responsibility is to organize review of AEA's environmental proposals. For the past few years, we've been able to accept about 15 to 20 proposals each year. Our TIG encourages proposals from 5 main environmental and conservation areas of interest, and these are shown on our website. So for instance, conservation biology, environmental policy and management, environmental education, evaluations of energy programs such as energy efficiency programs, and international global issues under which climate change has become a lot more prominent in recent years. So we also accept proposals from other environmental issues as well, although these are our primary focus areas. So like the Conservation Measures Partnership and the Environmental Evaluators Network, we want to help promote a stronger community of practice in environmental evaluation. In the past, we've done this in fairly small ways to help members better network. So for instance, we developed a newsletter to keep people informed of upcoming events or to introduce TIG members. For several years now, we've also organized a field trip during the conference where we go to a site like the Denver Zoo, which is the upper photo, to learn about their environmental programs and to share our ideas about evaluation of the program. We're definitely interested in furthering communication amongst our members to increase networking and sharing of ideas and methods, but we're also aware that the Environmental Evaluators Network and the Conservation Measures Partnership play a role in this space as well. So that's one reason we thought it would be helpful in this webinar to discuss our organization's similarities and differences and the best roles for us moving forward. We also are developing our website to share information and resources. And here's our homepage with various tabs that we'll be building out over the coming years. So who makes up the membership of the Environmental TIG? Well, last September we surveyed our members, and this is one of the things that respondents told us. So respondents in general had experience in both evaluation as well as the environmental or conservation field, although slightly longer tenure in evaluation than in the environment. It also appeared that more people who were new to the environment were experienced in evaluation as opposed to vice versa. But still, even despite that, over 40% of them had over 10 years experience in at least one or the other field. And I think one distinguishing characteristic between these 3 organizations might be that people in the environmental TIG may have a stronger association with evaluation and see themselves more as evaluators, and we could debate this or what this means during the discussion period of this webinar. So who can join? Anyone who's a member of AEA can join, so this simply requires AEA's annual membership fee. And within the TIG, there are a few opportunities for getting involved. So first, each year we send out a call for reviewers. It's not an arduous process. We have enough reviewers so that each one reads fewer than 5 proposal abstracts for the conference. But you get to see what types of proposals come in and be a part of the selection process to create a strong conference program. Secondly, we always welcome participation on the leadership team in either a formal role, such as someone being the lead for communications, or in an informal capacity, such as providing general input or engaging in one-time activities. We meet every month or 2 to tackle ongoing tasks. Third, people can get involved in discrete projects identified by the leadership team. So for instance, you could be interviewed for the newsletter, or write an article for the newsletter, or host a webinar such as this one. And in particular, we're really interested in activities that increase communication and networking amongst the TIG members and help people improve their evaluation methods and practice within the environmental and conservation field. And with regards to networking, people can get involved in the ongoing activities that our TIG has during the AEA conference. So this includes attending conference sessions, going on the field trip to learn about the real-world application of evaluation in an environmental context, or even just simply meeting other TIG members during our business meeting or our dinner. So that's just a quick summary of AEA's environmental TIG, and I'll stop here so we can try to see if we can bring on that team.
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you, Matt.
Yes, fantastic.
Welcome, Matt.
Hello, Yvonne.
Hey there. Nice to be heard.
All right, anytime you're ready, we see your screen.
Are you looking at an email or are you looking at the website?
We're looking at your website.
You. Okay. Hello, everybody. Christina, thank you very much for coordinating and organizing this this webinar. A great opportunity to, I mean, very selfishly myself, hear what's going on in the work of the AEA TIG and with the CMP. Nick and Christina, it's great to hear both of your voices and hear what you're up to. The Environmental Evaluators Network. I think that the first mention of anything around that called an Environmental Evaluators Networking Forum was in 2006. And I believe I even remember where Christina was standing and where Nick was sitting on that day in 2006 in June when we had that first meeting. I wasn't working with EPA at that time. I just returned from World Cup in Germany. And wasn't really in the mindset, but later I found out that they had an invitation for maybe 40 folks to come to this meeting, and they ended up having 80 or 90 respond and attend that first meeting of a bunch of folks who are similar to, as Nick described it, very interested, concerned, terrified by demands on their time and reporting and activities related to performance, evaluation, effectiveness, and providing evidence for what works and what doesn't. And I think there was a lot of demands at that time that were very much unrealistic, and it had a lot of people concerned. We had a few more meetings like that first one that Christina had such a big part in organizing. And each year there were very similar conversations, but it was clear that it was an evolving conversation, and we were hearing from many different parts of the environmental world, and that includes natural resource management, biodiversity conservation, environmental protection, and there were a lot of similar concerns, and the conversations were very much about sharing what the frustrations were and the demands were and how you were dealing with it here and they were dealing with it there. It was a few years later that meeting that was happening each year was formalized into now what we're calling, or what's called, the Environmental Evaluators Network, where the purpose of this network is to advance the field of environmental evaluation through more systematic and collective learning amongst evaluators and evaluation users. The representation in those meetings was extraordinarily diverse straight from the start in terms of organizations that were involved. We had everything from local government to transnational institutions participating in that event. Disciplinary diversity, the scale at which organizations would work, the subject matter that focused on geographically diverse as well, U.S. From around this country and globally. So we saw this, enormous diversity, but these common interests in systematic and continuous improvements, and a diversity of ways that folks were moving toward that, whether it be through what was viewed or what's viewed as formal evaluation, performance management, adaptive management, and many of these things are interrelated, and we're learning from each other in how we approach all of those. The forum was the first way, or these fora were the first ways that participants in the Environmental Evaluators Network were communicating. And you see on the website here, there's at the top a number of different regions of the world represented. In those different regions, we've had a number of events. So, for instance, in the U.S., we've had these annual fora that have, ranged from 80 or 90 people to 300, 350 people, and they've been basically here in DC, but we've had some attached to AEA events in the past, and also we've had some regional events in the US as well. In Europe, a number of different organizations in Europe have organized EEN events there, in Canada and Mexico, and more are in the works at the moment. So where we started out with just these meetings, I guess, because, and these are some of the differences, I guess, I'm speaking to related to the other organizations, you know, CMP and AEA. There is no formal organization. There's no legal, and this is both similar and different. There is no legal standing for Environmental Evaluators Network. It's not a nonprofit. It's purely self-organizing. There are individuals who inject a lot of energy. I have been a part of that, and others on this call, I'm sure. And so we've moved into, there's groups that organize to write papers or special editions of journals and publish blogs and webinars. We do have a LinkedIn group here with, I think, 2,500 members on it. Please join. Your conversation be very welcome. There's a Twitter feed as well that's fairly active. And so this information exchanging and sharing in these various ways has been important. There's been a number of workshops that have been organized under the EEN banner. Again, the topic, subject matter, geography of those is extraordinarily diverse and disperse, because it's basically, if you care about environmental management, and depending on how you define systematic improvement, you're welcome to participate in EEN and bring that brand to the initiative that you would like to promote, you know, in the name of systematic improvement. So we have had a number of workshops recently. One last year was exploring the nexus of biodiversity conservation, systems thinking, and evaluation, and those were in London, and we've had a few elsewhere since. We had a workshop in June here in DC that was explicitly about, and you see this mentioned on the front page, architecture of environmental evaluation. This is something that started some years ago, and the idea is what happens if you, since the very first meeting in 2006, people have asked the question, so where are all these evaluations that everybody's doing, and who's doing what, where, when, how, and what are you learning? And you know, that conversation went on for some years. It always tended to get to this place of we need a database, and then everyone would walk out of the room pretending they didn't hear that. Well, we've gotten to this place now where we have had a meeting in June, and we had 15 or 20 organizations represented from all over the world, and there was a very big interest in this question: what happens if you had 10,000 evaluations in hand and you were able to put them on a technical infrastructure that was able to analyze and synthesize information out of them about who is doing what, when, where, and how? And so we've had the technical expertise involved, the folks who know how to do that stuff, and also the folks that are demanding this evidence and those that are producing it as well. So check that out on the website. We're designing ways for folks to get involved, and I'll be specifically talking about this at the next EEN forum, which is in Florence in a couple weeks, next week in fact, talking about Archie. And this particular event here is co-hosted by the organization you see on your screen, and also the European Environment Agency. And you'll see that they've chosen a particular emphasis for this event based on the interests of the Paris climate meeting in December. So that's the next EEN event. I believe the one in 2016 in Europe is going to be in Copenhagen. And there will be a different topic there. You'll see that we have this close connection to AEA. I think that there was a major step last year where we had visionary evaluation for a sustainable, equitable future as the theme. Beverly Parsons was the president last year, and she put sustainability at the fore, right at the front of considerations for the evaluation community. And she did it in a way so that we heard from a number of leaders in the evaluation community that they're viewing their work in this field in theory and practice differently than before, and that they can never engage in another evaluation that is only human-centric, and that the environment, sustainability, and balance of these things will always be a part of their work from here forth, which was, I think, the point of starting that conversation. So I believe is Beverly's participation in EEN over the past 5-7 years that resulted in her making sustainability top tier in the evaluation view last year in the U.S. So those are some things about the history, mission, diversity, and activities of the EEN. And again, Christina, grateful for the time to chat a little bit, and I'd be anxious to answer any questions or speak with anyone later on if you'd like.
Great, Matt. Thank you so much. At this point in time, I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and answer questions from folks. So if you would, please feel free to go ahead and use the question feature that we have. I'm going to go ahead and start and take a couple of the questions that folks have posed already. And while we're waiting for folks, we'll start with those. So one person, Stephen, asked if the EPE-TIG does things in between the conference other than the webinar.
Hi, Stephen. Well, the leadership team does the proposal review, so we organize the proposal review. In terms of if you're asking more about whether or not we bring members together between the conferences, we actually in the past have not done much of this. And so this webinar was kind of our first foray into having some kind of event where we are trying to interact more with the TIG members. If there appeared, when we did the survey last year, there appeared to be greater interest in having that. We just want to make sure that we're not necessarily duplicative of efforts that the Environmental Evaluators Network or the Conservation Measures Partnership already have to bring people together. There is an e-group feature on the in the American Evaluation Association website that we could use to communicate more and share resources and ideas and discussions as a TIG that we are thinking about promoting and starting.
Great, thank you. One other thing, just to respond to one of the comments that was shared, we will make these slides available on the EPE-TIG website. We'll post those under our resource page. We know that some of the slides did go by a little quickly, but we'll make those available to you all there, as well as the audio. Okay. Any other questions from folks? While we're waiting, I actually will go ahead and pose a question. What opportunities do you all see for further collaboration between your groups?
This is Nick. I can try to field first answer to that. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of almost a production process that you can think about here in terms of improving learning and getting better knowledge and information about the work that we're all doing. And I think, for example, the Conservation Measures Partnership, from the presentation that I was giving, I hope I left you with the understanding that what we're really trying to do is create the conditions for project managers to be collecting information in a systematic way about their projects, and ideally sharing that with ways of having common vocabularies and ways of framing their issues so that people can learn from each other. To me, that's a precursor of evaluation, and then a lot of the tools in the Conservation Measures Partnership, like some of the theories of change, results chains that we use, those can be used as a basis for either prospective evaluations, or actually, if you need to do a retrospective evaluation, to sort of look at the underlying theory of change that people are doing. So I think what we're doing in a lot of ways is setting up people to be able to do evaluations, but that kind of then hands it over to the evaluators themselves, who I think are more represented by the groups that Christina and Matt are involved in terms of taking that information and starting to make sense of it in an evaluative capacity.
Great, thank you. Christina or Matt, would you like to share?
I definitely agree with Nick.
Great.
Yeah, that's been really fascinating to see how we have, I'll just speak for myself, come to understand how the relationships between these different parts, for instance, if we're talking about adaptive management, evaluation, evidence-based practice, systematic reviews, sort of running the gamut of approaches that are taken by participants in these various networks here, how they relate, and just recently how we've seen, for instance, Nick mentioned Andrew Pullen and his work with the collaboration of environmental evidence. I think it was some years before we really got a clear view on the relationship between evaluation and systematic review, or the synthesis of evaluative work, to put it very simply. And now understanding that more clearly, because of that relationship, we're beginning to see how one feeds in, reinforces, improves the other, just as Nick was explaining how the evaluators are providing a particular type of capacity that will be supporting the work in conservation measures partnership, and then many other disciplines are providing other sorts of capacity. That sort of sharing certainly could be improved and bolstered by continuing to sort of formalize these sorts of discussions and the relationships between these networks and others.
This is Nick. If I could just maybe add one thing to what Matt just said, and maybe a question for Matt. I mean, I think one of the interesting things here is that there's some fundamental units issues that have to be solved or sorted out. For example, Matt, you were showing the database. You had this idea of the database of different evaluations that have been completed. In a funny way, the unit of that database is the evaluation itself, whereas I think if you look at how CMP approaches the world, our fundamental unit is both the projects that people are implementing and then the actions within those projects. And obviously there's a correlation. You could say it's an evaluation of a project, but it is interesting to think about how you even structure the information and what's the fundamental units for those databases and what are the fields and what is the meta information that's being collected so that people can do this kind of stuff that Andrew and others are doing.
Yeah, I know people like you can figure that stuff out, Nick, so I'm not too worried about it, to be honest. I think that this work with, for instance, this Archie initiative, it's been very much about sort of not a reaction to, but something that we've realized in these conversations about what is the utility of evidence generated through evaluation, what's the external utility or validity of that information, and just raising that question, if we have 1,000 evaluations in hand, is it really true that only a fraction of 1% of those are particularly useful in making decisions about the effectiveness of an intervention going forward because it was designed as an experiment or whatever that is? And when we got into that discussion, we found that there were folks that were designing approaches to, for instance, these technical infrastructures or databases that could help us to sort through the value of observational information that's included in much of our evaluations, and how that access to that information may be useful in making the next slightly better decision, rather than continuing to only look for or emphasize the silver bullet of yes or no, this intervention works in a particular place. It's a space that's being explored, and this sort of conversation is exactly what we need to make the most of that space.
Great. Well, thank you all. If Catherine Owen is still on the line, Catherine, would you like to ask a question? Okay. While we're waiting for Catherine, if there are other folks who have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you so that you can actually share your question. Any other questions? Let's go back and see what else we have here. Okay, so while we're waiting to hear from folks, can you all actually respond to any of the differences within your organizations? How are the three groups distinguished from one another?
This is Nick. I could take one. I mean, I think one obvious thing is, again, coming back to units, but who are the members of the different groups? And so I think that the Conservation Measures Partnership, as I kind of briefly said at the start, is a network of organizations. So that to be a member of the CMP, it is a conservation organization or a funder group that does it. There are individuals who represent those organizations, obviously, who come to the meetings and are sort of the representatives of that organization. But it's an idea that it is a network of organizations. And our sister group, the Coaches Network, is more a network of franchises, and within those franchises, individual coaches. So I think that's a little bit different, and I think that is different than what, for example, Christina was presenting, where, as I understand it, it's more evaluators, individuals who do evaluation work, who are then part of the broader AEA work. And I think, Matt, the Environmental Evaluators Network is somewhere in between.
Christina, I think I agree. I think that the way I see it, the Conservation Measures Partnership is definitely working at more the organizational level. While the American Evaluation Association, TIG, is working as specifically with individuals. I think another difference is that the Conservation Measures Partnership, one of the big things they have developed is using kind of the adaptive management cycle and developing open standards for the practice of conservation for improving conservation projects. In that adaptive management cycle, obviously, there's the planning, there's the implementation, the evaluation, and the adjustment. And I think the American Evaluation Association focuses primarily on that third step, on the evaluation, improving the methods and practice and use of evaluation, a little bit less so on some of the planning and implementation of conservation or environmental projects. And so I think it's a little bit more of a more distinct focus than the Conservation Measures Partnership has. And I think the Environmental Evaluators Network, Matt can speak to this, is a little bit more in between as well.
Great. Thank you. Well, we have a couple of questions, one from Beverly Parsons. She asks, how are each of your groups connecting with others or through other means to link environmental sustainability issues to social justice?
I can take one crack for the CMP. So one of the things that in the concept, as I said at the outset, and if you look at the roster of organizations involved in the Conservation Measures Partnership, it started off as primarily conservation organizations, so the World Wildlife Funds, the Nature Conservancies of the world, and groups like that, NIFIF and others. But I think that one of the things we recognize is that conservation takes place in complex social landscapes. And so if you look at some of the tools and even the frameworks that we use, we've been exploring increasingly using human well-being targets and sort of looking at the trade-offs between environmental work and conservation goals within social goals. And there's overlaps, there's positive synergies, but there's also trade-offs that have to be made. So we're trying to make sure we model that in our work. And I would say more broadly, we're also working with some of our more development-oriented partners. So, for example, USAID comes to mind. We're doing a big project right now with USAID through the Measuring Impact Project. We're just helping the USAID Forestry and Biodiversity team look at taking some of the tools from the open standards and bringing it into the USAID's program cycle. But we're also now branching out and actually experimenting and employing that with agricultural projects and other non-conservation applications of some of these same tools as well. And I think that gets into some of the justice issues as well.
All right, Matt or Christina?
So I'd say, yeah, maybe this is some part of a difference. I don't know if it is or not, but EEN, because it's not, if there's an emphasis on environmental justice, for instance, it's right. a choice of something to be emphasized by a participant in EEN. And also, because if evaluation is not the formal evaluation, or for instance the use of the evaluation standard is not necessarily the perspective that all participants in EEN come with, the evaluation standards or principles guiding practice of evaluation may or may not be a part of the approach that's promoted in an event or writing or communications or the initiatives that are under the banner of EEN. It's all very welcome, and it's not, at this point, there's no emphasis in a particular sort of values construct except for toward the systematic and collective learning about environmental evaluation.
Another way of putting what you're saying, Matt, is that I think all three of these groups are concerned more with methodology rather than the content, and so I think it's up to the individual projects or the individual things being evaluated to sort of talk about what their values and goals are, and what we're looking at is methodologies of are people reaching those goals and being effective at doing so.
Yeah, with the also recognition that the environmental TIG, when selecting conference proposals, definitely considers that as an important theme that we want to represent at the conference. If there are proposals that are submitted, then we definitely take that into consideration.
Okay, great, thank you. I do have a couple of other questions I want to run by you guys. We have a question from Ingo, and he's asking, he'd love to hear more about the database idea. How far along is that, and will it be structured to allow meta-analysis?
So Nick mentioned a database, and I did as well.
I didn't specify. Do you each want to take a crack at that?
Nick, do you want to go first?
I can. So I mentioned the databases of conservation projects and actions, and one of the things that in the Conservation Measures Partnerships, we've actually come to the realization that in a perfect world, if we really want to enhance learning and improvement over time from each other's experiences, sure, it'd be great to have one Uber database of all the conservation projects and all the conservation work that's been going on around the world. It's also pretty unrealistic because people value their data, there's confidentiality and things like that, and so we don't actually think it's that possible to come up with that one Uber database. But the good news is we don't have to. What we think we can do is by coming up with a set of standards for how to structure the information about conservation work, both the work that's taking place, but also the appropriate sets of metadata that enable people to understand what's going on. So where did the project take place, what were the conditions and things like that. We think we can actually, if we can create a set of databases that all use those standards and then agreed as appropriate to share information once it becomes public. There may be some information you want to keep private, but then make stuff public. We think we can almost accomplish the same thing as having that one metadatabase in a more realistic fashion. So all the databases that we are involved with, for example, Marathi Share that I talked about, we do pay a lot of attention to metadata, and one of the things that the Measures Partnership is now working on, we kind of worked on it a few years ago, and we're dusting it off and kind of attacking it again, hopefully in conjunction with IUCN, is a set of sort of standards for how to architect the kinds of information that would go into these databases, including the appropriate metadata.
Right. So the database, Archie, the database is one aspect of that. You know, we're essentially talking about knowledge management of evaluative evidence, and it's not exclusive to, for instance, bounded evaluations, but evaluative work of many kinds. And as to how far we are along, there's hard to say, but all the notes are on that Archie web page that I showed on the website there, and it will be an open access product where all of the data, all of the information that is put on the platform will be useful to, or usable, accessible by anyone. And there's a number of processes that are being put in place to how information flows onto that platform, in what form, and how it will be accessible. So I'd be happy to chat with you more about that.
Hey, Yvonne, this is Nick. Can I add one more thing to this conversation? And
certainly.
Here's the story I've been telling people a lot lately, which is a couple weeks ago, well, a couple months ago, my dishwasher jammed, and I had a clogged dishwasher. And the really interesting thing these days is I can now go on Google and I can type the model number of my dishwasher, so Bosch KB753, whatever it is, and the word clog drain. And instantly I will get 4 videos that someone made showing me how to unclog my dishwasher, right? So someone's gone to the trouble of showing you exactly how to reach in and reach the drain and open it up and do all this kind of stuff. What's interesting is I don't think we can do the same thing for a lot of the work that we do in conservation. So if I'm doing a certain treatment or I'm doing something, it's much harder to find that video or to find that information. And I think it's a card catalog issue because that model number of that dishwasher enables us to actually find that exact video that I'm looking for. It's searchable. Whereas I don't think for a lot of the stuff that we're doing, it's necessarily searchable because people use different terms for different things. And so I think that in terms of the metadata, it's the metadata, but it's also that card catalog, those common terms that enable a practitioner to find the information that they need at the right time is so critical, and that's a lot of what we're trying to do in the Conservation Measures Partnership.
Great, thank you. We do have another question from, we've got about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes left actually. One question from Cheryl Keaton, who's asking, as an independent consultant, not associated with a large organization or university, how can I get involved in current evaluations?
Christine, you want to take that one?
Yeah, taking just a moment to think about this. I think this is something that one way that we could use the AEA's environmental TIG to connect people more to opportunities for evaluation. So for instance, I work for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We do 1 to 3 third-party evaluations, a commission 1 to 3 third-party evaluations every year. We post those RFPs, requests for proposals, on the Environmental Evaluators Network. We share it with the American Evaluation Association's job board. But I think it would be really great if we could build a stronger set of players that we know that we can reach out to, for instance, for third-party evaluations. We could potentially use AEA's environmental TIG and the eGroup features there, or some other form of communication to connect people so that people like me who are the evaluation consumers can connect with people who are actually doing the evaluation. And that's definitely something that we are very interested in doing just personally from my own organization, let alone, and I know I've heard the same thing from a number of other foundations that have come to me asking, like, who can do evaluations, environmental or conservation-oriented evaluations. And so I know at least in that respect we can try to do a better job bringing the consumers and the people and the evaluators themselves together.
I'll just say that's great. Engage. I mean, engage in conversations that you know, not having now, whether it's at events like AEA or on LinkedIn or whatever it is. Engage. What comes out of that is unpredictable and often in line with what you want.
Great. Well, thank you. We've got about 2 minutes left, and I wanted to ask if either or any of our panelists wanted to share any closing remarks or statements before we end our call.
This is Christina. I just wanted to thank everyone for being patient with us as we learned our first webinar experience, but also just thank everyone for joining. We hope in the future for the environmental TIG to become more active in terms of the membership. The leadership team meets monthly. If you have any questions or suggestions for us or would like to become more involved, please reach out to me or anyone else on the environmental TIG, and I have the website addresses for the 3 organizations up here on the page right now. So just thank you very much, and like Yvonne said, we're going to be posting this webinar under the resource page of our TIG website.
All right, thank you so much. We'll appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Bye now.